"Ma'am, stop reaching for your briefcase," one of the officers said, and the entire courthouse plaza seemed to hold its breath. The words echoed across the polished stone entrance just after 8 o'clock on a bright Monday morning in Washington, D.C., where federal employees hurried towards security checkpoints with steaming coffee cups and leather portfolios tucked beneath their arms. Most people slowed only for a second before continuing on, assuming they were witnessing another routine police stop. A few lifted their phones, curiosity replacing urgency. Others exchanged uneasy glances without saying a word. Standing beside the iron fence that bordered the sidewalk was a black woman in a charcoal gray overcoat, her posture calm despite the tension building around her. She looked to be in her late 40s, with neatly pinned natural hair and a weathered brown briefcase resting beside her polished shoes. She did not argue. She did not raise her voice. Instead, she took one slow breath and quietly answered, "My identification is inside that case. Please verify it before making another decision." Officer Daniel Briggs barely glanced toward the briefcase before shaking his head. "We'll sort that out later," he replied, his tone clipped with the confidence of someone convinced he already understood the situation. His two partners, Officer Kyle Mercer and Officer Ethan Cole, stood several feet away, watching the growing crowd as commuters gathered near the courthouse steps. Somewhere in the distance, a metro train rumbled beneath the streets, and the morning breeze carried the scent of fresh rain from the night before. The woman remained perfectly still. Her expression revealed neither panic nor anger, only a quiet patience that somehow made the moment feel even heavier. She slowly looked toward the courthouse entrance, where sunlight reflected across rows of tall glass windows like sheets of gold. The building towered above everyone gathered outside, its marble columns casting long shadows over the plaza. A young law student whispered to her classmate, "Do you think she actually did something?" The other student shrugged. "I don't know. They usually have a reason." The woman heard every word but offered no response. She simply folded her hands in front of her and waited. Officer Mercer noticed the expensive leather briefcase again and frowned. "Funny," he muttered. "She doesn't look nervous." Briggs answered without taking his eyes off her. "Everyone gets nervous eventually." But she didn't. She continued watching the courthouse doors as though she expected someone to arrive at any moment. The calmness unsettled more than one person standing nearby. A television reporter crossing the street slowed her pace, sensing that something about the scene felt strangely incomplete. She signaled her cameraman to keep rolling, though neither of them yet understood why. Overhead, an American flag moved gently against a cloudless sky while courthouse employees streamed through the entrance with security badges hanging from Navy lanyards. One older clerk paused halfway up the stairs and stared toward the sidewalk. His eyes narrowed for only a second before widening with unmistakable confusion. He looked again, this time more carefully, as if struggling to believe what he was seeing. Before he could speak, another government sedan turned into the circular driveway beyond the security barriers. Its dark windows reflected the morning sun, and uniformed personnel immediately stepped toward the curb. Around the plaza, conversations faded one by one until only the distant traffic and the fluttering flag could be heard. Something had shifted, though no one yet understood what. Even Officer Briggs straightened slightly, sensing an unexpected change in the atmosphere. The black woman never moved. She simply watched the arriving vehicle with the same composed expression she had worn from the beginning, as though she already knew that truth never needed to rush because, sooner or later, it always arrived exactly on time. The black sedan rolled silently beneath the courthouse awning, its engine fading into the stillness that had settled across the plaza. Uniformed United States Marshals stepped forward with practiced precision, scanning the entrance before opening the rear passenger door. Yet before anyone inside emerged, the woman standing beside. The iron fence remained the calmest person on the entire block. Naomi Brooks had learned long ago that panic clouded judgment, and judgment was the one thing she had spent her entire career protecting. 23 years earlier, she had entered her first courtroom as a young federal prosecutor carrying a legal pad that cost less than $20 and a determination that could not be measured. She had earned every promotion through patience, discipline, and an unwavering belief that every person deserved to be heard before conclusions were drawn. Those who worked beside her often joked that Judge Brooks listened longer than anyone else in the courthouse, but they also knew that once she reached a decision, every word rested firmly on verified facts rather than assumptions. Even after becoming one of the youngest federal judges appointed in her circuit, she refused many of the privileges that came with the position. She usually drove herself when time allowed, carried the same weathered leather briefcase she had owned for more than a decade, and preferred arriving before most employees so she could review each day's docket in complete silence. That Monday had been no different. She had left her townhouse before sunrise, stopping only at a neighborhood bakery where the owner already knew her regular order: black coffee and a plain wheat bagel. She thanked the cashier by name, wished two construction workers a safe morning, and walked the final block toward the courthouse because she enjoyed the quiet before the city fully awakened. The briefcase resting a few feet away contained neatly organized case files, handwritten notes, and the identification she had politely asked the officers to verify. She knew exactly what was inside because she prepared every folder herself the night before, refusing to rely entirely on assistance for matters she considered personal responsibility. Nearby, Officer Ethan Cole shifted uneasily. Something about the woman's composure continued to bother him. In his experience, people caught in difficult situations usually filled silence with explanations, complaints, or visible frustration. Naomi did none of those things. She simply observed the courthouse entrance as though every passing second confirmed something she already understood. Around them, more federal employees slowed their pace. A maintenance supervisor carrying a toolbox looked toward Naomi twice before quietly removing his cap. He whispered something to the clerk beside him, but neither approached. They seemed uncertain whether interrupting would help or make matters worse. The courthouse clock struck 8:15, each deep chime rolling across the marble plaza with remarkable clarity. Pigeons scattered into the cool morning air, their wings briefly interrupting the silence before settling again on the stone ledges above. Officer Daniel Briggs folded his arms and glanced toward the approaching sedan, expecting perhaps another supervisor responding to a routine call. Instead, he noticed courthouse security personnel standing noticeably straighter than before. Even seasoned employees who rarely reacted to anything now exchanged puzzled looks. The atmosphere no longer resembled an ordinary stop outside a federal building. It felt like the opening moments of something much larger, something no one present had anticipated. Naomi lowered her eyes for only a moment, quietly smoothing one sleeve of her charcoal coat before looking toward the entrance again. Her breathing remained slow and steady. Whatever happened next, she intended to meet it with the same principle that had guided every decision throughout her career. Facts first, assumptions never. Officer Daniel Briggs had been wearing the badge for almost 14 years, and experience had taught him that hesitation could sometimes carry consequences. That lesson, repeated through countless briefings and long shifts, had become a habit stronger than instinct itself. Earlier that morning, his unit had received an urgent bulletin describing a financial fraud suspect believed to be approaching the federal courthouse carrying a dark leather briefcase. The description was frustratingly broad, mentioning only approximate height, dark overcoat, and the possibility that false identification might be used. Briggs had read the alert twice before stepping out of the patrol vehicle. Already frustrated that so little useful information had been provided, Officer Kyle Mercer shared that frustration. He quietly remarked that the bulletin should never have been released without a photograph, but the courthouse had already begun filling with attorneys, clerks, contractors, and visitors. Every passing minute increased the pressure to act before the suspect disappeared into the building. Officer Ethan Cole, the youngest member of the team, glanced repeatedly between the printed alert and the woman standing near the fence. Something did not fit comfortably in his mind. The woman had answered every question calmly. She had not attempted to leave. She had repeatedly requested that her identification be verified. None of those details resembled the behavior he expected from someone intentionally avoiding the truth. Still, he remained silent. Briggs stepped a few feet closer and studied Naomi once again. Her shoes were polished, but well worn. Her coat was tailored without appearing extravagant. Her briefcase showed years of careful use rather than the look of an expensive fashion accessory. She appeared more like someone who valued routine than someone attempting to escape attention. Yet confirmation bias had already begun shaping every observation. Because Briggs believed she might match the bulletin, every ordinary detail suddenly seemed suspicious instead of ordinary. Around them, courthouse employees continued arriving. A mail carrier pushing a cart slowed long enough to observe the scene before quietly continuing inside. Two assistant attorneys exchanged uncertain glances, but said nothing. Several tourists standing across the street assumed they had stumbled onto an important federal investigation and continued recording with their phones. Their whispered conversations drifted through the cool morning air, blending with distant traffic and the soft rustling of leaves from the courthouse courtyard. Briggs noticed the cameras but refused to let them influence his decisions. He believed that showing uncertainty in front of a crowd could undermine authority, even if privately he wished the identification could simply be checked. Mercer folded his arms and quietly said, "If we start making exceptions every time someone asks us to trust them, we stop following procedure." Ethan looked toward Naomi again before answering carefully. Procedure also includes confirming identity whenever possible. Briggs did not respond immediately. His eyes drifted toward the courthouse entrance where additional security personnel had quietly gathered beneath the marble columns. They were not rushing. They were simply watching. That alone struck him as unusual. Usually, courthouse staff ignored routine law enforcement activity unless assistance had been requested. This time, several employees remained unusually still, speaking into radios with expressions that revealed concern rather than curiosity. Naomi noticed none of this with visible emotion. She continued standing with remarkable composure, her eyes occasionally lifting toward the courthouse clock before returning to the entrance. The morning sunlight reflected gently across the bronze clasp of her weathered briefcase, highlighting years of careful use rather than neglect. She understood something the officers did not. Assumptions often felt convincing because they required so little effort, while truth demanded patience. And patience, she had learned over decades on the federal bench, was often the first quality abandoned when pressure entered the room. Somewhere beyond the security barriers, another vehicle turned slowly into the circular driveway. This time, several courthouse officials began walking forward together with unmistakable purpose, and the quiet uncertainty hanging over the plaza became impossible for anyone present to ignore. The courthouse officials moved with deliberate purpose rather than urgency, their polished shoes tapping softly across the marble walkway as the morning crowd instinctively stepped aside. None of them raised their voices. None of them appeared alarmed. Yet the quiet confidence in their pace carried a weight that gradually silenced every nearby conversation. Officer Daniel Briggs noticed the group approaching and instinctively straightened his posture. Beside him, Officer Kyle Mercer glanced toward the arriving officials before looking back at Naomi Brooks. "Do you know any of these people?" he asked. Naomi met his eyes without hesitation. "Some of them know me," she answered calmly. Her voice remained even, almost gentle, carrying neither resentment nor sarcasm. Briggs folded his arms. "Then this will be cleared up soon enough." Naomi gave a slight nod. "That is exactly what I have been hoping for since I asked you to verify my identification." The words landed with quiet precision. There was no accusation hidden inside them, only a reminder of the simple request she had repeated from the very beginning. Ethan Cole lowered his gaze for a brief moment. He remembered every opportunity they had been given to confirm her identity, and each one had been postponed because the initial assumption had seemed easier to trust than additional verification. Around them, more people gathered along the courthouse steps. A security contractor quietly removed his earpiece, sensing that whatever was unfolding no longer resembled an ordinary misunderstanding. Several young attorneys who had been discussing motions only moments earlier now stood silently beside the entrance, watching the scene unfold with growing uncertainty. The cool breeze carried the scent of freshly brewed coffee from a nearby cafe, while sunlight reflected across the courthouse windows in bright ribbons that seemed almost too peaceful for the tension lingering over the plaza. Naomi shifted her attention toward her weathered briefcase resting only a few feet away. "Officer," she said respectfully, "if you allow someone to retrieve the credentials inside that case, everything can be resolved in less than a minute." Briggs looked briefly toward the briefcase before answering. "We have already explained that we will complete our procedure first." Naomi inclined her head slightly. "I understand your responsibility. I simply hope that responsibility always leaves room for verification. Mercer crossed his arms more tightly, believing the conversation had reached its end, but Ethan found himself studying Naomi more carefully than before. He noticed the careful stitching on her coat sleeves, the small notebook tucked neatly inside the side pocket of her briefcase, and the remarkable steadiness in her breathing. Nothing about her suggested someone trying to avoid accountability. Instead, she carried herself like someone who had spent years listening before speaking. Nearby, the television reporter quietly instructed her cameraman to continue recording. She sensed the story had shifted away from law enforcement activity and toward something much deeper about assumptions and patience. Even several pedestrians who had initially continued walking now returned to the edge of the plaza, drawn not by excitement, but by the unusual silence surrounding the woman at the center of the gathering. Then the first courthouse official reached the security barrier. His eyes settled on Naomi for only an instant before surprise crossed his face. He immediately removed the identification badge hanging from his neck, held it respectfully against his chest, and quickened his pace without breaking into a run. Behind him, two United States Marshals exchanged brief looks before following several steps behind. Briggs noticed the change immediately. Experienced officers learned to recognize body language long before words were spoken, and every person approaching seemed to recognize the woman standing quietly beside the fence. For the first time that morning, certainty began giving way to doubt. The confidence that had carried the officers through every previous decision no longer felt as solid as it had only minutes earlier. Somewhere above the courthouse entrance, the large bronze clock marked another passing minute, its deep chime echoing through the plaza as every eye slowly turned toward the officials drawing closer with unmistakable purpose. The senior courthouse administrator reached the security barrier first, slowing only long enough to exchange a brief glance with the United States Marshals walking beside him. His expression changed the instant he recognized Naomi Brooks. Surprise gave way to concern, and concern quickly settled into quiet disbelief. Without saying a word, he removed his glasses, looked once more to be certain, and continued forward with measured steps. The conversations surrounding the plaza disappeared, almost completely. Even the television reporter lowered her microphone, sensing that words might interrupt a moment none of them fully understood yet. Officer Daniel Briggs stepped toward the approaching officials before raising one hand in a polite gesture. "Can we help you?" he asked. The administrator answered carefully. "I believe I can help everyone if we take a moment to clarify what has happened." Briggs nodded, still determined to follow procedure. "We are handling an active investigation." The administrator looked toward Naomi and then back to the officers. "Have you confirmed her identity?" The question lingered in the cool morning air. Briggs hesitated for only a second. "Not yet." The administrator lowered his eyes briefly, almost as though he wished he had misheard the answer. Beside him, one of the marshals quietly studied Naomi's face before offering her a respectful nod. Naomi returned the gesture with the slightest smile, neither relieved nor offended, simply acknowledging a familiar colleague. Ethan Cole noticed the exchange immediately. It was subtle, but unmistakable. These were not strangers recognizing a passerby. These were professionals greeting someone they already knew. Mercer shifted his weight uneasily. The certainty that had supported every decision throughout the morning now felt increasingly fragile. Naomi remained composed. Her breathing never changed. She looked toward Briggs and spoke with the same calm tone she had maintained from the beginning. "Officer, I appreciate that you have responsibilities this morning. I only ask that every decision be based on verified facts. That principle protects everyone equally." Briggs listened without interrupting. For the first time, her words no longer sounded like a defense. They sounded like advice. Around them, courthouse employees quietly formed small groups along the entrance steps. Several whispered among themselves, recognizing Naomi immediately, but choosing not to interfere. They understood that public confrontation would help no one. Truth, once verified, could speak clearly enough on its own. A soft breeze carried the sound of the courthouse flag moving above the columns while sunlight reflected across the marble plaza with remarkable brightness. The scene appeared almost peaceful despite the uncertainty resting over every person present. Ethan finally spoke. His voice was lower than before. "Sir, perhaps we should check the credentials in the briefcase." Briggs looked toward the worn leather case resting exactly where Naomi had indicated from the beginning. The request sounded perfectly reasonable now, yet accepting it meant acknowledging that an earlier opportunity had been overlooked. Before Briggs could respond, one of the United States Marshals stepped forward respectfully. "Officer, with your permission, I believe verifying identification would be in everyone's best interest." No authority challenged another. No voices were raised. The entire conversation unfolded with professionalism, yet every passing second increased the weight of the unanswered question. Briggs slowly exhaled. He realized the growing crowd was no longer watching because of the police activity. They were watching because they sensed a misunderstanding approaching its turning point. The assumptions that had seemed so convincing only minutes earlier were beginning to crumble beneath something far more powerful than confidence. They were giving way to evidence. And as every experienced investigator eventually learns, evidence has a quiet way of changing everything once people are willing to look at it. For several long seconds, no one moved. The plaza that had buzzed with hurried footsteps only minutes earlier now rested beneath an almost unbelievable stillness. Even the distant traffic seemed softer, as though the city itself had paused to wait for the next decision. Officer Daniel Briggs looked from the United States Marshal to the worn leather briefcase, and then toward Naomi Brooks. The confidence that had guided him since sunrise had quietly given way to reflection. Beside him, Officer Kyle Mercer loosened his folded arms, while Ethan Cole remained focused on the briefcase that had been sitting in plain sight from the very beginning. It was remarkable how ordinary it looked. Scuffed corners, a polished brass clasp, and a handle softened by years of daily use. There was nothing dramatic about it, yet it had become the silent center of an entire morning's misunderstanding. Naomi continued standing with remarkable composure. She neither rushed the conversation nor attempted to influence it. She simply waited, understanding that truth rarely benefited from impatience. Throughout her years in federal court, she had witnessed countless moments where assumptions collapsed the instant evidence entered the room. Those memories now passed quietly through her mind. She remembered reminding young attorneys that confidence, without verification, could never replace facts. She remembered instructing juries that fairness demanded patience even when circumstances appeared obvious. Standing beneath the bright Washington sky, she found herself living the very lesson she had repeated to others for decades. The courthouse administrator stepped forward once more, speaking with respectful restraint. "Officer Briggs, I believe everyone here shares the same goal. We all want to be certain we are acting on accurate information." Briggs nodded slowly. There was no challenge in the administrator's voice, only professionalism. Around the courthouse entrance, employees continued watching in complete silence. Some recognized Naomi immediately, but deliberately avoided calling out her name. They understood that public embarrassment would solve nothing. Allowing the truth to emerge naturally preserved dignity for everyone involved. A gentle breeze stirred the American flag above the courthouse columns, sending its fabric rippling against the clear blue sky. Sunlight reflected across the marble steps, creating bright patterns that stretched toward the gathering below. The television cameraman quietly lowered his lens for a moment, sensing that the most important part of the story was no longer the recording itself, but the lesson unfolding before his eyes. Ethan finally broke the silence. "Sir," he said carefully, "every report we complete begins with verified identification. We still have that opportunity." Briggs looked at his younger partner. There was no criticism in Ethan's words, only a reminder of the standard they had sworn to uphold. Together, Mercer quietly exhaled, realizing that the conversation had shifted away from suspicion and toward responsibility. No one was trying to assign blame. Everyone simply wanted to make certain the next decision would be the correct one. Naomi lowered her eyes briefly toward the courthouse steps before lifting them again. She noticed several young interns watching from the entrance, their legal notebooks tucked beneath their arms. They would remember this morning for years to come, perhaps not because of the misunderstanding itself, but because of how professionals chose to respond once doubt appeared. Character, she often believed, revealed itself most clearly after mistakes became visible. The United States Marshal extended one open hand toward the briefcase without touching it. "Officer, with your permission?" Briggs remained silent for another heartbeat. The weight of every earlier decision rested upon that single moment. Then, almost imperceptibly, He gave a slow nod. Across the plaza, conversations remained absent. Only the sound of the morning breeze and the faint tolling of the courthouse clock accompanied the simple act that everyone now understood should have happened from the very beginning. Verification was finally about to replace assumption. Officer Daniel Briggs stepped toward the weathered leather briefcase with measured movements, no longer driven by certainty, but by the quiet obligation to confirm what should have been confirmed from the very beginning. The United States Marshal remained beside him, saying nothing, allowing the officer to complete the process himself. The brass clasp clicked softly as Briggs opened the case. Inside, everything was arranged with remarkable precision. A neatly organized calendar rested beside several folders stamped with the seal of the United States District Court. A pair of reading glasses lay inside a protective case. Beneath them rested a dark blue credential wallet. Briggs carefully removed it and opened the cover. His eyes stopped moving. The color drained from his face almost instantly. Printed beneath the federal seal were the words he had never expected to read that morning. The identification belonged to the Honorable Naomi Brooks, United States District Judge. The photograph matched the woman standing only a few feet away with complete certainty. Briggs read the name twice before his breathing slowed. For several seconds, he seemed unable to speak. Ethan Cole noticed the change immediately. "Sir," he asked quietly. Briggs handed him the credential without answering. Ethan looked down and felt his stomach tighten. Every question that had troubled him throughout the morning suddenly found its answer. Mercer stepped closer, studying the identification for himself. His shoulders lowered as realization replaced confidence. Around them, silence spread even farther across the plaza. The courthouse administrator closed his eyes briefly before offering Naomi a respectful nod. One of the United States Marshals placed a hand over his heart in greeting and said with unmistakable respect, "Good morning, Your Honor." The simple words echoed more powerfully than anyone expected. Heads turned across the marble steps. Several courthouse employees instinctively straightened their posture. A law clerk quietly whispered, "Judge Brooks." And within moments recognition passed from one person to another. The television reporter lowered her microphone completely. She no longer saw a dramatic confrontation. She saw a lesson unfolding in real time. Briggs slowly looked up from the credential toward Naomi. She met his eyes with the same calm expression she had carried since sunrise. There was no satisfaction on her face. No anger. No attempt to embarrass anyone. Only quiet dignity. The officer's voice became almost unrecognizable. "Your Honor, I." The words faded before he could finish. Naomi offered a gentle smile that carried more grace than judgment. "Officer Briggs," she said softly, "everyone has difficult mornings. What matters most is what we choose after discovering the truth." Ethan lowered his eyes, reflecting on every moment that had led them there. He realized the smallest request Naomi had made had also been the simplest. "Verify my identification." Nothing more. Nothing less. The courthouse clock sounded another deep chime above them, rolling across the bright morning sky while sunlight reflected from the courthouse windows onto the polished stone below. The breeze carried the sound of the American flag moving steadily above the entrance, almost like the building itself had exhaled. Briggs carefully closed the credential wallet and held it with both hands before returning it to Naomi with visible respect. "Your Honor," he said quietly, "thank you for your patience." Naomi accepted the credential without haste. "Patience," she replied, "has protected justice far more often than certainty ever has." No one around the plaza spoke after that. They simply stood together beneath the courthouse columns, each person understanding that authority was never measured by how loudly someone spoke or how quickly someone acted. It was measured by the willingness to pause long enough for truth to be seen before judgment was made. The silence that followed seemed to soften every sharp edge of the morning. Officer Daniel Briggs lowered his shoulders, no longer standing behind certainty, but behind humility. He looked toward Naomi Brooks once more, searching for words that could honestly acknowledge what had happened without diminishing its importance. "Your Honor," he said quietly, "I should have listened when you asked us to verify your identification. I allowed urgency to replace careful judgment, and I regret that." His voice carried across the plaza with complete sincerity. Officer Kyle Mercer stepped forward beside him. "I made the same mistake," he admitted. I believe the first explanation I gave myself instead of taking the extra minute to confirm the facts. Ethan Cole remained silent for a moment before speaking as well. I should have insisted sooner that we verify your credentials. I knew something did not feel right, but I hesitated. Naomi listened without interrupting. She had heard countless apologies during her years on the federal bench. Some were offered to reduce consequences. Others came from genuine reflection. She recognized the difference almost immediately. Looking at the three officers before her, she saw professionals confronting their own decisions with honesty rather than excuses. The courthouse employees continued watching quietly, allowing the conversation to unfold without interference. A few moments earlier, many had expected anger or public criticism. Instead, they witnessed something far more meaningful. Naomi carefully placed her credential wallet back inside the weathered leather briefcase before closing the brass clasp with a gentle click. The familiar sound seemed to mark the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. She looked first toward Ethan, then Mercer, and finally Briggs. Every profession that carries authority also carries responsibility, she said softly. Judges, police officers, attorneys, marshals, all of us make decisions that affect other people. None of us are protected from making mistakes. What protects the public is our willingness to recognize those mistakes, learn from them, and improve the next decision. Her words settled over the plaza with remarkable calm. No one felt accused. No one felt diminished. Instead, they sounded like the lesson of someone who had spent decades believing that justice was strongest when it remained connected to humility. Briggs nodded slowly. "We will review everything that happened this morning," he said. "Not because someone demands it, but because we should." Naomi smiled gently. That is exactly how accountability begins. The courthouse administrator quietly thanked the officers for their professionalism in resolving the situation once the facts became clear. One of the United States Marshals added that every agency benefited when people treated moments like these as opportunities to strengthen trust rather than protect pride. Around the entrance, the small crowd gradually began returning to their morning routines. The television reporter quietly lowered her camera. She realized the most powerful part of the story was not the misunderstanding itself, but the choice everyone made after discovering the truth. There had been no shouting, no public humiliation, and no desire for revenge. Instead, there had been patience, verification, accountability, and grace. Naomi adjusted the strap of her briefcase and looked toward the courthouse doors waiting at the top of the marble steps. In only a few minutes, she would preside over another day of hearings, reminding strangers that fairness depended upon evidence rather than assumption. Yet the lesson had already begun outside the courtroom before the first case had even been called. She paused before taking her first step toward the entrance and quietly said, "Justice does not become stronger when one person wins. It becomes stronger when everyone remembers that truth deserves to be verified before conclusions are reached." The officers watched her walk toward the courthouse with renewed respect, understanding that the greatest authority they had witnessed that morning had not come from a title or a courtroom. It had come from quiet dignity, steady character, and the courage to answer misunderstanding with wisdom instead of resentment. The courtroom settled into its familiar rhythm only a short time later, yet for everyone who had witnessed the morning outside, the room felt subtly different. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting long golden lines across polished wooden benches and the dark oak council tables. The quiet hum of air vents mixed with the gentle rustle of legal papers as attorneys organized their files and court staff prepared the day's docket. Judge Naomi Brooks entered the courtroom with the same calm professionalism she had carried throughout the morning. She greeted the courtroom with a respectful nod before taking her seat, her expression composed, her voice steady, and her attention focused entirely on the responsibilities before her. Anyone entering the room for the first time would have seen only a federal judge beginning another ordinary day. No one would have guessed the lesson that had unfolded just outside those courthouse doors less than an hour earlier. Among those seated near the back of the courtroom were Officer Daniel Briggs, Officer Kyle Mercer, and Officer Ethan Cole. They had requested permission to attend the morning session after completing their reports because each of them wanted to remember what true professionalism looked like. They listened carefully as Judge Brooks reminded everyone present that every decision made inside a courtroom must rest on evidence, fairness, and respect for the dignity of every individual. Her words were part of her usual opening instructions. Yet to the three officers they carried a deeper meaning than ever before. They no longer sounded like legal principles printed inside a handbook. They sounded like values that had been demonstrated through quiet patience rather than powerful speeches. During a brief recess, Ethan stood near one of the courthouse windows overlooking the plaza where the morning misunderstanding had taken place. The same iron fence remained there, unchanged beneath the bright afternoon sun. Courthouse employees crossed the walkway carrying folders and coffee cups, completely unaware that a simple moment of verification had become a lasting lesson for several people. Briggs joined Ethan by the window and spoke softly. "I have worn this badge for years, but today reminded me that confidence is never a substitute for confirmation." Ethan nodded. "I think that lesson will stay with all of us." Mercer smiled thoughtfully before adding, "Maybe that is how trust is built, one careful decision at a time." Their conversation ended as the courtroom deputy announced that proceedings would resume. Later that afternoon, after the final case had concluded, Naomi quietly gathered her papers and placed them inside the same weathered leather briefcase that had accompanied her through countless hearings and countless ordinary mornings. Before leaving the courtroom, she paused beside one of the young law interns who had witnessed everything outside. The student hesitated before asking, "Your Honor, how did you remain so calm?" Naomi smiled gently. "Because anger rarely reveals the truth any faster. Patience gives people the opportunity to choose what kind of professionals they want to become." The intern thanked her quietly, understanding that the answer reached far beyond the events of a single day. As Naomi stepped outside, the late afternoon light bathed the courthouse steps in warm amber tones. The breeze carried the sound of leaves moving through nearby trees while the American flag continued its steady motion above the marble columns. The plaza had returned to its ordinary pace, but for those who had been there that morning, nothing felt quite ordinary anymore. They had witnessed that genuine authority did not come from titles, uniforms, or assumptions. It came from integrity, humility, and the willingness to let truth speak before judgment. Naomi walked toward the sidewalk carrying her familiar briefcase, disappearing into the flow of the city without seeking recognition or applause. Behind her, the courthouse remained standing in quiet dignity beneath the evening sky, a lasting reminder that justice begins not with certainty, but with the courage to verify, the wisdom to listen, and the character to treat every person with fairness before reaching a conclusion.